Oh, there's a gust of bitterly cold wind. I better hurry up because the Cailleach is shrieking at me. Conas tea, how are ye? Welcome back to the Candlelit Tales YouTube channel. In this video, I am going to talk to you about a goddess who is maybe not so well known in Irish mythology and maybe not so well known outside of Irish mythology. She has a lot of aspects, like a lot of the gods in Irish myth, but the main one that I'm talking about today is her aspect as the goddess of winter and this season in Ireland from Samhain to Imbolc. So the 1st of November to the 1st of February. That's how Irish people count seasons. It's different to other parts of the world. But she is the Cailleach and she is the goddess of winter. In our video about Irish gods, we talk about uncertainty, we talk about how much has been lost, we talk about how much we cannot be sure of. This is my standard disclaimer at this point, that there's a lot that we don't know and there's a lot that we can't know because a lot of that knowledge has been lost and suppressed and deliberately done away with over the years. I'm not going to tell you things that I think are carved in stone. I'm not going to tell you things that you should be taking as gospel. I'm going to tell you what I know from my experience as a storyteller and lover of Irish mythology. And if you disagree with me, leave a comment about it politely and be sound, and we can all have a conversation. Now, in talking about the Cailleach, and particularly in talking about her as a winter goddess, I really want to stress that this is part of that ambiguity, because the Cailleach exists in different forms in different places. In Ireland, and particularly in the southwest of Ireland, she's a very prominent figure in a lot of stories. In Scotland, there are also a lot of stories of the Cailleach, but in the Scottish stories, she's way more a shaper of landscape and she has much less to do with winter. In Ireland too, she is a shaper of landscape. She is associated with the land and she is associated with particularly the winter season of the land. She's not really named as being one of the Tua de Danann. She's one of those figures, a bit like Manannán mac Lir, who's like maybe outside of that pantheon, if we can call it a pantheon. She doesn't seem to have like family ties to the other gods and goddesses. She kind of stands apart. She's also sometimes counted as one of the aspects of the Morrigan, because the Morrigan can show the face of a Cailleach, of an old woman, but I think she stands a little bit singular. There's also a possibility that she's an aspect of Danu herself, that she's like the winter aspect of this sort of land goddess. There's so little information left about Danu that that's pretty much pure conjecture, but like, where would we be without pure conjecture? I first encountered the Cailleach as a character in a story and not as a goddess. Dahi O'Hogan, in his book The Lore of Ireland, calls her like undoubtedly a goddess in origin, and that's kind of good enough for me. But when you first meet her, that's maybe not how the Cailleach would strike you, because I think we have a very different view of what a goddess is and what a goddess looks like. You know, she's Venus on the shell, or she's Aphrodite with the sexy girdle, you know, beautiful paragons of femininity and seduction and like, you know, just oozing sexuality is kind of how we think of goddess, I think, a lot of the time. Or you think of like mother goddess, like that warm embrace, the pillowy softness, just the gentleness and the nurturing. This is not that. This is not that character. This Cailleach is the flip side of all of that. And so the descriptions for her in Irish mythology are just deliciously vivid. Hair like a horse's mane, limbs spotted with sores and warts of all kinds, twisted and gnarled, joints swollen and arthritic, teeth like gravestones in an old churchyard that are like mossy and pointing in different directions, a foul stench. And in one particular story that I often quote, it's said that you can see through the tears in her ragged tunic all the way down to her knees, long tangled locks of filthy pubic hair. And if that's not enough to get you demonetized on YouTube, what's YouTube even doing these days? So she's not a beautiful goddess. She is an incredibly powerful goddess. And whenever she shows up in stories, she often has something, she has a very important role to play. Now, part of the Cailleach as well is that she kind of embodies this idea of like health in old age. she is asked in one story how she got to her great age, and she answers that it is by never letting her head be bare under the sky or her bare feet touch the earth, and by rising out of bed as soon as she wakes up. Which are kind of healthy living things, I guess, in Ireland. You know, not going out without a hat was a big one for like my grandmother. And, you know, my mum still gets on at me about walking around barefoot because she thinks I'm going to catch my death of cold in July. I mean, fair enough, I would at this time of year. There's this kind of idea around her of like reaching a great age and having great wisdom to share. Now let's talk about the Cailleach in different places, because the place that is most associated with the Cailleach is the Beara Peninsula in West Cork. In fact, she's often referred to as the Cailleach Vera, the hag of the Beara Peninsula. Beara means, it comes from an Irish word that means short or short grass. So it is the peninsula where the grass doesn't get very long. The southwest of Ireland is particularly associated with the other world. So this might be a link to the Cailleach having otherworldly origins or a gateway into the other world in that place. She has a couple of different names from this part of the world. One of them is Boy, which is not just me saying boy in a Cork accent, boy, but is B-O-I fada, and I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. And she's also called the Santena Vera, which means the old woman of Beara. There is a story about the Cailleach Vera from about the 10th century in which she's described as having 50 foster children, and she's also described as having had 7 periods of youth, having renewed herself 7 times to youthfulness, and in each season of youth taking a husband and outliving that husband who dies of old age, and that her children and grandchildren are now like the peoples and the races of the world, which links her back into this idea of being a sovereignty goddess. That's one of her more important aspects in the Irish myth, is that she crops up as a goddess of sovereignty and as a goddess of land. And you see that in, like, there's an old Irish tradition around kingship that the king marries the land, but the land outlives the king, obviously. And so the Cailleach is sort of, you can see her in that location in that story. But the Cailleach Vera is not the only Cailleach that there is. There are 2 sister hags in a lot of folktales. She's got 2 sister hags in Kerry. She's got one on the Dingle Peninsula and one on the Ivera Peninsula. Am I saying that right? I don't know. Anyway, there's a folktale about the Cork hag falling on hard times, and her sister from Dingle decides to like do her a good turn and decides to bring her an island, which she drags down south as far as Ivera, where it splits. And there are 2 islands there called Scariff and Deanish that are supposed to be the split of the island that this hag was trying to bring down to her sister. There's also a story about Loch Crew, which is a megalithic cairn complex, like grave complex in Meath. There is a seat on one of the cairns that is referred to in folklore as the Cailleach seat, and there's also a story that the cairns themselves were stones being carried by the Cailleach as she leapt from hilltop to hilltop, and that she dropped them or maybe deliberately scattered them where they are. This was before they were like excavated and people were like, oh, it's a burial, it's a little megalithic tomb, it's a burial. We didn't know that then. We just knew that they were very strange formations that looked like they might have fallen out of the apron of a giant hag. Now, I mentioned the sovereignty goddess connection, and the stories of the Cailleach, the stories where she shows up, are mostly king stories. Not all, but mostly. Probably the most famous of those is the story of Niall of the 9 Hostages. I think to this day it remains our most commented on YouTube video that we've ever made because of the number of people saying, I'm a direct descendant. Which, if you are, like, good for you. That's great. You're in really good company. So Niall of the 9 Hostages in this story, he's one of these semi-historical kings where he was a real person. There was a real Niall who seems to have ruled, but the events of his life have been heavily mythologized. And in one of the important stories about Niall, where he takes the kingship from his brothers, because he has 4 half brothers who are legitimate sons of the king, and he is the youngest and also illegitimate. And there's a big furore about who's going to inherit, because we didn't do primogeniture in Ireland. We didn't do just eldest son. It was a pool of candidates. If you were a king's son, you were part of the pool. Niall and his sons went out hunting. They were struck by a supernatural thirst. Then each of them went out searching for water in turn, and they found a well guarded by the Cailleach. Cast your mind back to a few minutes ago when I told you what she looked like, and this figure of ancient reeking hideousness proposed to each of the king's sons in turn that she would give them water in exchange for a kiss. And only Niall was man enough to do it, and not only did he kiss her, but he laid her down on the grass and made love to her. And after that, some versions will tell you that it was before this, but I am very insistent that it was after this. After he made love to the Cailleach, she transformed into a beautiful woman. And in a lot of versions of the story, she directly tells him, I am sovereignty, ugly to win but beautiful to hold. I am an allegory. Here's water, go give it to your brothers, but make them swear fealty to you before you give them water. There's a story of King Mongan where Mongan's wife, Dovlaca, is like tricked away from him by another king called Brandov. And in order to get Dovlaca back, Mongan goes to the Hag of the Hills, who's just called the Hag of the Hills. She's not really given any more name than that. We don't know what hills she comes from. But Mongan goes to her and asks her for help, asks her to come with him as a guest to Brandov and Dovlaca's wedding, and transforms her for the evening into a beautiful woman. And they dance together, and Brandov, who only stole Dovlaca to get at Mongan, sees Mongan with this beautiful woman and immediately proceeds to swoop in and cut into the dance and steal her from Mongan, who of course only wants to get his wife Dovlaca back. So after Mongan leaves, Brandov spends the night with this, what appears to be a beautiful lady, and wakes up the next day next to the Hag of the Hills, concluding the story with the famous line, I wish I didn't see you. Which, fair, relatable experience for some of us. But this trope of transformation is one that you see a lot in the Cailleach stories. Stories of this kind are often referred to as Lothy lady stories, and you see them crop up in other parts of Europe. I have been informed by people who study these things that the Irish stories are the oldest and maybe the origin of this sort of Lothy lady trope, where you have to kiss the hag and then she turns into a beautiful woman and rewards you. It also seems that Ireland is the only place where sometimes she turns back. So you can kiss the beautiful maiden and she can turn into a Cailleach, which, again, relatable. She shows up not in her Lothy lady form at the end of the story of Conor O'More as a sort of prophet. Conor O'More is the story of a king that is, it's very much a cautionary tale. He breaks one of a series of gasa on him and brings disaster on himself and his kingdom. And at the sort of 11th hour, he's surrounded, he's embattled, he knows he's going to die. He's holed up in this hostel, waiting for the axe to fall. And a Cailleach knocks on the door and asks to come in. And he has been told not to let anybody in these specific circumstances. But he decides that he cannot compound this sequence of failures by annoying the Cailleach. So he lets her in and she rewards him with a prophecy. It's not a very nice prophecy. It's a prophecy of his death, but it's still a reward. So she doesn't always really change the course of history in the stories, but she's recognized in that moment as being way too important a figure for him to actually offend or turn away. There are some other Cailleach stories where she shows up in. Like I said, most of them are king stories. Not all of them are king stories. She also turns up in a story of Cuchulainn. There is a Cailleach who's sometimes given the distinct name of Mal, who falls in love with Cuchulainn at first sight. Cuchulainn does not share her feelings because Cuchulainn, famously the most beautiful man in all of Ireland, is confronted with this, refer back to the description at the start of the video, hideous creature. But he's also terrified of her magic and believes that if she touches him, she'll get him under her control. So Cuchulainn, a very, very brave warrior, flees from the hag, north, south, east, west, tries to lose her all over Ireland, cannot lose her until he comes to the cliffs of Moher and leaps off onto the sea stacks and jumps from sea stack to sea stack. That's hard to say. And the Cailleach follows him, but slips and tumbles and falls to her death in the waves. But 3 days later, her head washes up on shore and is to this day petrified. And you can see in the cliffs of Moher, you can see the hag's head. It's in a place called the Hag's Head. She also turns up in a Fianna story. Diarmid and the daughter of the King of the Country Underwave, which is a mouthful of a title, but there you go. She can't be Princess Underwave because that's not how titles work in ancient Ireland. Diarmuid falls in love with this woman after meeting her first as a Cailleach, and she's been cursed into the form of a Cailleach and has to persuade a member of the Fianna to let her sleep in bed with him. Diarmuid is the only one compassionate enough to do it, and when he wakes up the next day, it is next to a beautiful, radiant woman of the other world who gives him everything that he could possibly dream of. But things don't last between them. It's a whole story. It's quite a long story, actually. But this kind of Cailleach aspect sometimes shows up in that way as well, where it's like there's a temporary Cailleach situation, and then she's transformed back into her, youth restored. And I want to say a word on the word Cailleach, because I've been calling this figure the Cailleach all the way through this video. That is just a word in Irish that means old woman in most places. It actually comes from a word for a veiled person, so like a person who's maybe a nun or is wearing a veil, but it has come to just mean generically old woman. So in parts of the country it is not pejorative, and it's also not linked to this ancient pagan goddess worship. But I think maybe it is a nice feature of the language to remember that as people age and grow old and as their appearance changes, we kind of get close to that form of the Cailleach. We get close to embodying the Cailleach. And maybe that is a nice thing to remember, that with age comes wisdom and clarity and sovereignty. And maybe it is good for us to remember that Cailleachs are worthy of respect in every form that they take. Let me know in the comments below if you've heard of the Cailleach before this, if you have heard of other aspects or other stories of the Cailleach. What do you think her most important aspect is, or her most interesting aspect is? Do you have any unresolved questions? I do, but if you have any unresolved questions, maybe we can brainstorm it out in the comments. And also let us know what other aspects of Irish mythology would you like us to talk about on this channel. You can do all the YouTube things. It really, really does help us out. You can like, you can comment, you can subscribe. It's a very, very crowded algorithm, and we are a very, very small channel. So you can also hype videos now, I believe, although I'm not quite sure what that does. And if you really, really like the things that we do, you can join the Candlelit crew and support us directly. But if you don't want to do any of that, that's also fine. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. You!